Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever you are. A warm welcome to all of you to this webinar of Christians for Israel International and Think. Warm welcome to all of you. What's Christians for Israel and what to think about? Christians for Israel, we are a ministry and we have a mission to teach about the biblical importance of Israel and the Jewish people in our faith. And Think, the Hague Initiative for International Cooperation, their mission is to promote the fair and joint application of international law in international relations, in particular to the State of Israel and to the Israel-Palestine conflict. A warm welcome to our guest speakers. Mrs. Anna Hertzberg from Israel of NGO Monitor and Dr. Bren Carroll from Australia of the Zionist Federation in Australia. And of course, Mr. Andrew Tucker of Think in the Netherlands. And I'm seeing that many are attending this webinar. We are very happy. Such a huge number of participants in this webinar. I see people coming from Asia, New Zealand, Oceania, and Europe and New Zealand and many other places. My name is Cornelis Kant and I'm the Executive Director of Christians for Israel International. So what is this webinar all about? And why is it important for Christians and Jews as well to know what's going on? This webinar is about the role of the International Criminal Court and the potential war crimes committed in Judea, Samaria, and particular in East Jerusalem. The International Criminal Court recently decided to investigate so-called war crimes. And even the Israeli settlement policy is called a war crime by the ICC. The ICC claims that by enabling Jews to live in East Jerusalem, the old city of Jerusalem, that it is committing war crimes. And this allegation raises huge important questions. The key question in this webinar is, are the settlements a war crime? And what's the connection between the recent decision of the International Criminal Court and what's happening in the current situation in Israel, the riots, the rockets, and so on? For example, do the potential evictions in Sheikh Jarrah amount to war crimes? Is Israel annexation of East Jerusalem a war crime? Isn't Jerusalem the heart of the Jewish nation? Isn't Jerusalem not the heart of the Jewish people? At the end of this webinar, I would like to share with you a biblical view on this issue. But first, we're going to watch a short video clip made by Johannes Gerloff in Israel about what's a settlement. So we have an idea, an imagination of what's a settlement. And then, after the video clip, Andrew Tucker will address you and start the webinar.
The international community focuses on Israel. Everybody is asking, what is a settlement? I want to show it to you. This is what you're normally being shown. Some containers in the middle of nowhere, some desert land. Some of the settlements developed into little towns with several thousand inhabitants, like for example Ariel or Givat Ze'ev, or we have here Ma'ale Adumim, which is at the eastern front of Jerusalem. Ma'ale Adumim was built on the eastern part of Jerusalem after 1973, the Yom Kippur War, when the Israeli leadership understood that there is no barrier for the Jordanian army to attack Jerusalem. So Ma'ale Adumim really had a defensive significance. We have to understand why Jews live where they live. Will it be for, or might it be for, life quality reasons, or might it be for ideological reasons, that they came here because they believe in the Bible and say we want to stay here, or may it be for historical reasons? If we see here Jerusalem, we have to understand, for example, down here in Wadi Juz, there lived Jews throughout all the millennia. I personally know a Jewish man who was born in the 1930s, long before the State of Israel was founded, down here in Wadi Juz. And you have not just here in Jerusalem, in the Old City, in Silwan down, but also in Tiberias, in Tzfat. If you go into the so-called occupied territories in Nablus, in Shechem, in Jericho, in Gaza, in other places, you had always Jews living there. Finally, we are on a hill overlooking Jerusalem and Ramallah. On this hill, actually, King Saul, the predecessor of King David, had his capital. And later on, King Hussein tried to build here a palace, and then the Six-Day War kind of interrupted his efforts. We oversee the whole Jerusalem area. We see Jerusalem, we see Ramallah, and in between. If we start in the south, we see where the old city is and the city center of modern West Jerusalem. And if I go to the right, we see Ramot, and behind it, Mevaseret Zion even. And there is the tomb of Samuel. We all see this from the center of Beit Hanina. We go further to the north, we see the city center of Ramallah, and before it, just in front of it, we see Atarot, which is today an industrial area, the old Jerusalem airport, and behind Ramallah we see Psagot, and to the right, further to the east, we see Neve Yaakov and Pisgat Ze'ev. So, you may choose according to what you want to say, according to your ideology, whether there are 60,000 settlers beyond the fence, the wall, or whether you have, according to Israeli definition, something like 400 settlers beyond the green line, or if you take the European definition of what is occupied territory, you have between 150,000 and 1 million settlers. That would be 10% of the Israeli population that the international community wants to relocate.
Well, thank you very much to Johannes Gerloff in Israel. And I think the point that Johannes is stressing there very much is that Jews and Arabs have been living for centuries, for millennia, side by side in this land. And Jews belong in the territory of Jerusalem and in Judea and Samaria. Now, we are fed in the media with a binary kind of idea, a black and white idea that it's Jews against Arabs, and the idea of freeing Palestine, that Israel is a colonizing power that is settling Jews from Europe into an area that they don't belong in. And the purpose of our webinar today, dear friends, wherever you might be throughout the world is to get a little more insight into what is this land and what is at the heart of this conflict. We thought of this webinar several weeks ago in light of the International Criminal Court's recent decisions, and we wanted to look into this idea of settlements being a war crime. Well, of course, in the meantime, over the last 10 days or so, the whole region has erupted, and we now have a conflict, a massive conflict between Israel and Hamas in the Gaza Strip. But this conflict with Hamas is not an isolated conflict. And what is actually happening here is a conflict between Israel and the broader region. And is very much about East Jerusalem. So we want to share with you today, and I'm so delighted to have Anne Hertzberg and Bren Carlill with us as we think about what is East Jerusalem, what is the history of this area, why is it important, and why is it significant, not just for Israel, but for all the nations. And Bren down in Australia represents the Zionist Federation in Australia. That's the example of a country which has taken a very clear stance in relation to this conflict. And we want to understand why that is the case and why other nations also should be taking a similar position. Now, before I share a few thoughts with you, before we will go into conversation with Anne and Bren, I'd just like to acknowledge both of them. Anne Hertzberg is the legal advisor of NGO Monitor in Jerusalem. So she's calling in today from her home, I guess, Anne, in Jerusalem. You're very welcome. It's good to have you with us. It's important to have your voice from Jerusalem at this time. So thank you so much. Anne is great. Anne's an attorney. She was an attorney in New York. She's been living in Israel for almost 20 years. She helps run NGO Monitor, which looks very closely at the role that NGOs, non-government organizations, play in relation to the conflict and the financing of these NGOs by other governments. It's important work. She's a prolific author and writer on many of these issues, and she's a specialist in human rights law, international humanitarian law, and the role and the jurisdiction of UN institutions. Dr. Bren Carlill down in Melbourne on the other side of the world. Welcome, Bren. Good to have you. It's in the, beg your pardon, it's in the evening down there. Bren is a political scientist. He is a doctor of political science from the University of Melbourne. He has written a book called The Challenges of the Resolution of the Israeli-Palestine Conflict. So he is an expert second to none in what this conflict is all about and how it could possibly be resolved. And we'll look forward to digging into that. He's the Director of Public Affairs at the Zionist Federation of Australia, which is the main umbrella body for Zionist and Jewish organizations in Australia. So welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
Now, what is East Jerusalem? What is it all about? I'm going to share with you a few slides just to, I think, understand the context of this conflict. So here we see the Temple Mount, which you might recall about 10 days ago when this conflict flared up. One of the triggers that set this thing off was the fact that this was towards the end of Ramadan, hundreds of thousands of Muslims on the Temple Mount. The Temple Mount is run by the Islamic Waqf, which is really under the control of Jordan. And Muslims have access to the two mosques, which are on top of the Temple Mount. You see there the Golden Dome, and in front of it, the Al-Aqsa Mosque. It's a very important place for Muslims. It's also the place where the temple once stood, and it is, of course, a very significant place for the Jewish people. And when things got a little bit out of hand on the top of the Temple Mount. The Israeli police intervened, and this triggered off the conflict with Hamas in the Gaza Strip. And Hamas entered into this conflict under the pretense of being a liberator of Jerusalem. Their whole purpose of starting to send rockets into Israel was in order to free the Al-Aqsa Mosque and in order to free Jerusalem from the Zionist infidels. So this conflict with the Gaza Strip, with Hamas, has got very much to do with Jerusalem. Here we have the Western Wall, which is the most significant place at the moment to which the Jewish people have access. This is the wall which undergirds the Temple Mount, and it is the holiest place for the Jewish people because it is the closest they can get to where the temple once stood. And you can see again there the mosque at the top left-hand corner overlooking the Western Wall. So you can understand how significant this is. This is all in what is known as East Jerusalem, what was territory that was occupied and controlled by Jordan for 19 years before the Six-Day War. This is a map of the municipality of Jerusalem, and Johannes Gerloff in the movie we just saw was showing to us parts of Jerusalem. And we can see the black line which surrounds Jerusalem is the municipality as it is now run and organized by Israel and has been the case since the 1967 Six-Day War. And Jews and Arabs live in Jerusalem, and Israel's purpose and objective is to more and more integrate East and West Jerusalem so it becomes one truly united city. There are, however, of course, Arab areas and there are largely Jewish areas. But these are areas which have developed over the last decennia into Arab and Jewish areas. But historically, Jews and Arabs have been mixed in all of these areas. And this is true of the region known as Sheikh Jarrah, which is one of the areas that has again triggered this crisis where a number of families are threatened with eviction, Palestinian families from houses which are owned by Jewish Israeli owners. And it's a subject of court proceedings. We'll come back to that later. We need to understand this is a regional conflict. And I'm showing you this map just to show you these are the traditional enemies of Israel. We have Syria in the north. Israel is still in a conflict with Syria, the conflict that was started in the War of Independence and continued in the Six-Day War and in the Yom Kippur War, has never ended with Syria. There is no peace with Syria, and Syria still threatens Israel on a daily basis. We have Iraq, we have Iran towards the east, which is perhaps Israel's greatest threat today, and it is Iran that is supplying Hamas with rockets that Hamas is firing into Israel. Hamas is also allied with Hezbollah, which is stockpiling rockets and weapons in Lebanon, which are also supplied by Iran, and which Hezbollah is ready to fire into Israel any day. So this conflict with Hamas is very much a regional conflict. Now, how did the Jews get into Jerusalem in the first place? Again, we need to, I think, push back against this idea is that the Jews don't belong in East Jerusalem. This is Palestinian. Well, this is not, East Jerusalem is not Palestinian. It's very much the heart of Jewish identity and Jewish history, and it's very much the heart of the history of Jerusalem. So very briefly, 100 years ago, this is what the region looked like. This was under the Ottoman Turkish Empire. And to the bottom right, you can see what became known as Palestine, which was simply a sub-region of the area that was run from Damascus, all under the control of Istanbul and the Turkish Ottoman Empire. Mandates were created after the end of the First World War. We're talking 100 years ago, when the Allied powers won the First World War, and they were faced with the challenge of what to do with the territories of the Ottoman Turkish Empire. And this was the beginning of the concept of self-determination of peoples. And Arab peoples were claiming self-determination, and so were the Jewish people. And this is what was decided, that as far as the area here is concerned, of what has become known as Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, Jordan, and Israel, that this would become a series of mandate territories. Mandates were intended to enable the peoples of those territories to reach independence and autonomy. And one of those people groups whose autonomy and right to autonomy was respected was the Jewish people. And it was decided that the area of Palestine should become the home for the Jewish people. This is what Palestine looked like when it was decided by the Allied powers. This is the territory that is now known as Jordan and the West Bank, the Golan Heights, Gaza, and Israel. But it was all intended to be the locus, the place where the Jewish people would have a right to return from the diaspora to this area to establish their homeland. Now, we don't have time to get into the details. It didn't talk about a state, for example. It didn't say that the homeland should necessarily be in all of Palestine, but clearly the homeland was to be in Palestine, and Jerusalem was at the heart of this homeland. A decision was made very early to separate Transjordan from Palestine, and this was the beginning of the modern state of Jordan, which was created a number of decades later, and it controlled by the Hashemites from Saudi Arabia. But to the left, to the west of the Jordan River, we see Palestine, which was, again, under the mandate to become the homeland for the Jewish people, recognizing, of course, that most of the population in Palestine were non-Jews. They were Arabs, and they were a mixture of other people groups who'd been living there for hundreds of years. And the idea was that the Jews and the Arabs would live together, but Jews would have a right to return from the diaspora where they were suffering from pogroms and from exclusion, particularly in Russia, to establish their homeland. Now, fast forward a couple of decades to post-World War II. This homeland was never really established. The Arabs objected to it. The Arab world claimed that this was Arab territory. A proposal was put to the United Nations that it should be divided. And I'd just like to stress to you, this idea of dividing the land has been on the table for 100 years. It's nothing new. And so many proposals have been made, but nothing has ever really worked. Nevertheless, this was one of the ideas, the partition plan to the UN in November 1947. This is what might have happened, but never did happen, in which Jerusalem, you can see in the middle, would have become an international city governed by an international peacekeeping force or something like that. And there would have been an Arab state and a Jewish state. Now, this resolution was never adopted because it was rejected by the Arabs, including the Palestinian Arabs. They didn't want the creation of a Jewish state at all. They wanted all of this territory. The next step was the creation of the state of Israel when the mandate for Palestine came to an end in May 1948. And the very next day, Arab armies from Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, Egypt, and Jordan attacked this new state of Israel. And it was a bloody war, and it was a miracle that the Jewish people survived at all, but they did. And the result was a kind of de facto division of Palestine. And Jordan occupied the West Bank, as it became known, and Egypt occupied the Gaza Strip. Jordan later tried to annex the West Bank. Gaza was never annexed by Egypt. It's always been left in a kind of limbo. And most of the Palestinians by that point were living in the West Bank or the Gaza Strip. Nevertheless, Israel had a minority of Arabs, and today, to this very day, 20% of Israelis are non-Jews. They are Arabs or people of other ethnic backgrounds. It's very important to understand Israel is a democratic state where there is a place for Jews and non-Jews, even though it is a Jewish state. That's another story. We come to the Six-Day War in 1967. Again, the Arabs prepared to attack and to annihilate Israel. We need to understand that the whole objective of the Arab League at this time was the annihilation of Israel. This wasn't about land for peace. This was about recapturing Arab land. And Israel took a preemptive strike against Egypt in the first instance. At the beginning of June 1967, Jordan quickly entered into the conflict, and it was a fully fledged conflict between Israel and the Arab surrounding states, which sent their armies in, and of course, also with the Arab Palestinian population. Israel took a large amount of territory. This was an unexpected outcome of the Six-Day War. It included the Sinai Peninsula, which it took from Egypt. And so began Israel's challenge to think about how to manage these territories which had conquered from the Arab armies in the Six-Day War. And Israel's position has always been, and I'm sure Anne will perhaps mention this later, that Israel is willing to negotiate for peace. It said that clearly after the Six-Day War. We will not give back the territories unconditionally. We will negotiate for peace. And we're willing to give back a large amount of these territories, maybe even all of them, if the Arabs will only enter into peace with us. And Israel did enter into peace with Egypt and gave back the Sinai. And it has entered into peace with Jordan, which relinquished its claim to the West Bank. And gradually, step by step, it became a conflict between Israel and the Palestinians. But I want you to understand there's a number of Arab Islamic states out there, particularly Iran, which are dedicated still to the annihilation of the state of Israel. Let's zoom in very quickly on Jerusalem before we move into thinking about the International Criminal Court. As we've shown, Jerusalem, after the 1967 Six-Day War, was united by Israel, which has been trying to integrate what had become West and East Jerusalem under the Jordanian occupation. It's not an easy task because there have been these areas that have traditionally, over those decades, been built up as Arab communities. And many Arabs are not Israeli citizens. They hold Jordanian passports, many of them. They are Israeli residents, but they are in a kind of a limbo, many of the East Jerusalem Palestinians, between Israel and the Palestinian Authority. The Palestinian Authority is doing everything it can to empower the East Jerusalem Palestinians to oppose integration within Jerusalem. So this is a very difficult process. Nevertheless, this is all under Israeli control and sovereignty at the moment. And Israel believes that the whole city of Jerusalem belongs to the state of Israel. As you can see, there is this line which runs through the heart of Jerusalem. This is the line that the international community wants to reintroduce, as it were. It's the line that there was under Jordanian occupation. They want to divide Jerusalem again. And the whole UN setup is dedicated, and the European Union is dedicated to dividing Jerusalem again. Israel says this is not the pathway to peace. The only way to peace with the Palestinian Authority, with the PLO, is through negotiations and reaching some consensual understanding about Jerusalem. There have been many Security Council resolutions. We don't have time to go into them. We'll maybe do that on another occasion. A very important one, though, is Resolution 242, issued after the Six-Day War, which talks about negotiations between Israel and the Arab world in order to resolve the conflict. It does not talk about division of the land. It does not talk about the Palestinians at all. That came later, only in the 1970s. But over time, over the last decades, the power blocks within the UN have grown in their outspokenness in condemning Israeli control of Jerusalem. And there is a majority in the United Nations which claims that East Jerusalem belongs to the Palestinians. This is known as the two-state solution, in which East Jerusalem is to become the capital of a Palestinian state. At the moment, the West Bank, including what is known as Judea and Samaria, is run by the PLO and the Fatah, and Hamas is in control of the Gaza Strip. And there is a battle going on between Hamas and Fatah, a purely internal Palestinian war, as it were. And this is also part of the background of the conflict today. When the United States moved its embassy to Jerusalem in 2017, the UN General Assembly condemned it, and a vast majority of states condemned this move. A small minority of states did not condemn it. One of them was Australia, holding the view that the position of Jerusalem is to be a matter of negotiation between the parties. It is not for the UN to determine the status of Jerusalem. There are three main legal issues involved. I'm not going to go into them, but just so that you're aware of them when we talk about East Jerusalem. One is, first of all, the territorial state of Jerusalem. Does it or does it not belong to the state of Israel? Now, there's a whole body of international law about this, about where the borders of the state of Israel are. They're in contention. There is a dispute about this, but there is no simple answer. The second issue is about the law of belligerent occupation. You will be familiar with the terminology, the language that says that Israel is a belligerent occupier of these territories. It is breaching international law by moving its population into occupied territory. Well, Israel says Jerusalem and East Jerusalem have always been at the heart of the Jewish nation, and we are not moving our people into occupied territory. We are simply trying to integrate this city into what is clearly part of the Jewish state of Israel. There is a conflict about this law of occupation. Again, there is no simple answer, and there is no body in the world, there is no tribunal in the world which has the authority to make a binding decision on any of these. These are matters to be negotiated. The third issue is the issue of self-determination. The Palestinians have a claim to self-determination. They claim a right to statehood. Again, a complex area of law. There is no simple answer, even though the International Criminal Court thinks there is a simple answer. There is no simple answer. Again, these are matters for negotiation between Israel and the Palestinians. The question on the table then, and this is, we're going to open up the floor now, is the existence, the pure existence of Jewish people in East Jerusalem, is Israeli control of East Jerusalem a war crime, as the International Criminal Court claims? Why does it claim that? How does it claim it? What are the issues? The International Criminal Court was established 20 years ago only. It is a very new institution on the world scene. It has a jurisdiction to end impunity for the worst international crimes imaginable. And we have to think back to the Second World War, when the Nuremberg trials brought the Nazi German leaders to justice for their crimes against humanity in the Second World War. We are thinking of the worst possible crimes. This is what the court was set up to end impunity for, not to resolve political disputes, not to determine the self-determination claims of peoples, not to undermine the sovereignty of UN member states. It has a limited jurisdiction. but it has a prosecutor who has a right to launch investigations. And the prosecutor has announced, the current prosecutor, that she will start investigating Israeli and Palestinian crimes in the territory of Palestine, which includes, she says, East Jerusalem, the West Bank, and the Gaza Strip. So on that note, I'd like to open the floor to Anne and Bren to talk about this ICC decision. And Anne, I'm just wondering if you can tell us about how on earth the ICC has got itself involved in this dispute. How does it think that it has the power or the jurisdiction to prosecute Israelis or Palestinians, for that matter, for possible crimes that they might have committed?
Thank you, Andrew, for that introduction. And it is a very complicated question. It's a long story about how we've gotten here. The Rome Statute, which is the governing instrument of the International Criminal Court, which began operations in 2002, was negotiated and the final text was approved in 1998. And during the negotiations, the issue of settlements did come up, and the Arab states heavily lobbied to have a war crime included in the Rome Statute addressing the issue of settlements. And because of this, the Israelis, even though they were very supportive of the process to set up the ICC, they signed but would not ratify the Rome Statute. Now, the language, before getting into the specific language of the Rome Statute, I think it's important to note that the word settlement does not appear anywhere in the Rome Statute, nor in the Geneva Conventions, it should be added, and it's not defined anywhere. So that's very important to keep in mind. Now, the provision in the Rome Statute is Article 8 to B8, which falls under war crimes. And the language says, and I'll just read it so people can be aware of it, says that the transfer, directly or indirectly, by the occupying power of parts of its own civilian population into the territory it occupies, or the deportation or transfer of all or parts of the population of the occupied territory within or outside this territory. Now, people will say that this provision was based on Article 49.6 of the Fourth Geneva Convention, but it added some very significant language that is not found in the Geneva Convention. And that is the words directly or indirectly. Now, in the Geneva Convention, it just says that the occupying power may not transfer or deport parts of its own civilian population into the occupied territory. So this was a significant addition to the text. Now, originally when the text was passed, and the drafters of the text made very clear that this new language was not supposed to make this provision be interpreted beyond how people would be interpreting the Geneva Conventions. But it's unclear how this is going to be interpreted if there ever is a case involving this provision. There's never been a case involving settlements. And so this is really an open question. There's actually a lot of very significant issues. It seems like it's a very simple text that can be interpreted and applied, but it's actually quite complicated. For instance, how do you define the term transfer? What does that mean? Again, there's not a lot of precedent for which the court could rely upon. What specifically constitutes an act of transfer? What would constitute an indirect transfer? How is the term occupying power defined? That is the only place in the Rome Statute where that phrase appears. Who could be prosecuted for this type of offense? What types of people? Because I think it's important to note also that the ICC prosecutes individuals. It does not prosecute states. Now, of course, any proceedings at the ICC is going to be, sort of a public indictment of the country that is under investigation, obviously, and that's really already begun in our situation. However, the court can only prosecute individuals. So the prosecutor of the court has to prove that whoever they indict carried out the elements of this crime. So this is not such a clear-cut issue. And another significant issue is, when does the crime have to take place? Because according to the prosecutor, the court only has jurisdiction from the 13th of June, 2014. So, and that actually is even arguable. It might be later to that date. So, you know, how do you even measure when the supposed crime of transfer is taking place? Another issue that comes up when you're dealing with this issue is the issue of complementarity. So that's a very significant and essential part of the ICC. The ICC is not supposed to investigate or initiate cases if the state it is looking into has done its own investigations or prosecutions. So now in our case, in the Israeli case, the prosecutor has claimed to base her allegations that based on allegations she's gotten from NGOs and other anti-Israel partisans, that the Israeli Supreme Court never rules on the issue of settlements or legality. But that's really not the case. The Supreme Court has heard hundreds, if not thousands, of cases dealing with settlements. So again, this issue of complementarity is for sure going to come into play. And then, of course, I don't know if, Andrew, if you want me to answer it right now, but
well,
jurisdiction is really,
yeah, so I'd like to pick up on the question of jurisdiction, because even before you get to the question of whether or not Israel has or has not moved its population, Israel is not even a party to the ICC's Rome Statute.
correct.
And Palestine is not a state.
Correct.
So how on earth does the ICC, because the ICC is set up by the Rome Statute, it has power or jurisdiction, as it's called, in relation to crimes committed on the territory or by nationals of state parties. And if Israel is not a state party, how can you explain to us how the ICC gets to the point where it argues and believes that it has jurisdiction over Israeli leaders?
Right. So this is really the fundamental issue surrounding the ICC. So as you mentioned, Palestine is not a state under international law. Israel is not a member of the Rome Statute, primarily for the reasons I mentioned, because of this politicized language that was inserted by the Arab countries. In 2009, the Palestinians tried to join the court. And after a very long public relations campaign by the prosecutor, in 2012, the prosecutor ruled that he did not have the ability to open, he did not have jurisdiction and could not open a case investigating the situation. However, what intervened in that time frame between 2012 and now was when the prosecutor in 2012 issued his opinion about whether he could open an investigation. He essentially provided a blueprint to, and this was the former prosecutor, Luis Moreno Ocampo, he provided a blueprint to the Palestinians, basically saying if they could obtain statehood status from the UN, then, because under the terms of the Rome Statute, only states, the court only has jurisdiction over states, not non-state actors or parties. So he basically told the Palestinians, if you can get statehood status from the UN, then you could come back to the court and join the court. And that's essentially what the Palestinians did. They first tried to get member state status at the UN, which has to be granted by the Security Council. That was rejected. So what they did was they basically got a resolution, a General Assembly resolution passed to say that they were a non-member observer state. And the Palestinians then took that General Assembly resolution and used that to join the ICC. It's very technical, so I probably don't want to get into the details about how they were able to do that, but it just should be noted that General Assembly resolutions are not binding upon international law, and under really the terms of the Rome Statute and how states can join international treaties, The Palestinians did not have the capacity to do that. However, the prosecutor said that they did. And in 2015, the Palestinians purported to join the court. The prosecutor accepted that. So she began what is known as a preliminary examination process. She has several stages that she goes through when determining if she's going to open a full investigation. And in December 2019, she decided that she had reached the end of her investigation and that she did have jurisdiction to continue to open a full investigation. So what she did was she filed a brief to the pretrial chamber of the court to confirm that she had jurisdiction. And in this brief, she basically asserted three things. Number one, that the Palestinians could be considered a state because of this General Assembly resolution from 2012, not because they had met the criteria of statehood under international law. Number two, that General Assembly resolutions representing the views of the international community defined the territory of a Palestinian state as Gaza, East Jerusalem, and the West Bank, and therefore that was the territory over which she could assert jurisdiction. And then thirdly, she kind of made an alternative argument, was that because the Palestinians have the right to self-determination, therefore they were, I mean, really the only way I could really characterize it as sort of a prize that, you know, they could get the prize of ICC jurisdiction because they have this right of self-determination, which was a very kind of strange and new argument. The court took this filing under consideration, and in February of this year, in a 2-to-1 decision, basically said that she could continue with her investigation. Now it's interesting, the court in its majority opinion really did leave open a lot of space for challenging the jurisdictional grounds when it comes to an individual case. And the dissent in the case by Judge Kovacs, who's the head of that chamber, is quite interesting reading, and I would urge listeners to try to read it. It's quite long, 160 pages, but he really goes through the issues and why it is not in keeping with the Rome Statute that the Palestinians were allowed to become members of the court and for the prosecutors to exercise jurisdiction. So that's sort of where we are right now.
And so it seems to me you have two kind of separate things going on. You have Israel entered into Oslo agreements with the PLO to try and reach some kind of agreed, negotiated settlement of their conflict in which the Palestinians would achieve autonomy, self-determination of some sort. Those agreements in the 1990s, and that set up the Palestinian Authority, and now the West Bank has been divided into 3 areas. So you have a whole set of things happening there on a negotiated basis, but at the same time, the Palestinians go to the UN and they claim statehood, and then they use that to go to the ICC and other states, which now makes a decision. How do those two things fit together, and what did the court say about the Oslo agreements? Because it seems to me that's a very important issue.
Yeah, I mean, it's actually quite egregious. So as you mentioned, the Oslo Accords were negotiated and agreed to in the mid-90s. And essentially what they did was set up the Palestinian Authority. There had never been a Palestinian government before, and granted some autonomy and some powers to the Palestinian Authority with the intention that potentially that could lead to statehood, seeing on how things develop. An important part of the Oslo agreements was that the Palestinian Authority did not have any criminal jurisdiction over Israelis whatsoever, and also delineated how the territory was to be governed. And what the prosecutor has done by moving forward, she essentially ignored the Oslo agreements, because under international law, it's important to note that an international body can only exercise the powers that is delegated to it by the state. And so regardless of whether you call the Palestinian Authority a state, they did not have the power to delegate criminal jurisdiction over Israelis. So let's say even if they want to go ahead and exercise jurisdiction over the territory of the West Bank, parts of Jerusalem and Gaza, perhaps they could over Palestinian citizens, but they could not over Israeli citizens. But the prosecutor ignored that. And the other kind of really egregious thing, in my opinion, was the people who negotiated that agreement, there were several of them, filed amicus briefs with the prosecutor to explain how the Oslo agreements worked. And she basically ignored that and kind of rewrote the Oslo Accords on her own. So to me, that was quite shocking. And really, when you look at the Oslo agreements, that's kind of the end of the story. No, the court cannot exercise jurisdiction over Israelis. Nevertheless, the pretrial chamber, the two judges in the majority, basically did not really engage with that argument, and they basically just said that's not really a question for us at this time. So they kind of ignored it. But it's pretty significant because here you have this international body, essentially rewriting the terms of an international agreement.
Right.
Yeah, and really the other important factor is that the status of Jerusalem and the borders of the territory of a Palestinian state in Oslo are relegated to final status agreements. So when the ICC has now come in and said, even though they claim they were not deciding the borders of a Palestinian state, of course that's what they're doing. So, because now how could a Palestinian negotiating team ever settle for anything less? Even though these things are final status issues. So they've really inserted themselves in a completely political manner.
Right. Thanks, Anne.
Mm-hmm.
I'd like to turn to you, Bren, on this, because Australia made submissions to the courts arguing the court doesn't have jurisdiction. And after the court's decision, it publicly criticized the decision and saying we don't recognize Palestine as a state. What's Australia's position on this, and why do they consider this an important issue?
Thanks, Andrew. Well, look, as you said, Australia was one of a handful of countries that came out strongly against the ICC decision, and there are a couple of reasons why, and I think many of them are of interest or have impact on countries beyond Australia. Now, it's pretty well known that the Australian government is friendly to Israel, and it has taken a principled stand not to be a part of many of the international organizational efforts to isolate Israel. For instance, just about 2 weeks ago, the Australian Prime Minister announced that Australia would be boycotting the Durban Anti-Racism Conference this September. This is a conference that is intrinsically, despite being an anti-racist conference, is intrinsically anti-Israel and has lots of anti-Semitism in it. Now, Australia was only the second country in the world to announce that it would boycott that conference. Likewise, Australia frequently, every year, votes against many of the anti-Israel resolutions, and the Australian statement at the time always says, look, we're voting against this because it is unfairly critical of Israel. But I think that Australia's decision regarding the ICC, it goes beyond simply Australia being friendly to Israel. I think Australia is concerned about the ICC decision, both because Australian foreign policy tends to be quite pragmatic, but also Australia does traditionally have quite a principled approach to international law and international affairs. Now, Australia has not recognized Palestine as a state, because such a state doesn't exist, but many other countries have. Now, really, as Anne was saying, the Palestinians went to the UN, and which granted the Palestinians the non-member state status, but they were really able to do that on the back of, and again, the ICC prosecutor was able to say, look, it's not just a UN resolution. Plenty of actual governments have recognized Palestine as a state. But we should ask, do those states honestly believe that there is a state of Palestine? And I would argue that they don't. The reason that they have recognized the state of Palestine is out of solidarity with the Palestinian cause or virtue signaling for their own domestic audience, or indeed to place pressure on Israel or to signify intended outcomes of the dispute. But, obviously, just because a bunch of states have theoretically recognized Palestine doesn't mean Palestine exists. Now, as Anne pointed out, both Israel and the PLO have previously agreed that only negotiations would resolve the Israeli-Palestinian dispute. So, you know, Australia in principle rejects the idea that a court would intervene in this issue when the parties themselves had said, look, only negotiations between us can resolve this. But and so because of that, the Australian government was in a way forced to reject the court's decision. But I think it goes beyond that. And I think the Australian government recognises that the ICC decision lessens the prospects of Israeli-Palestinian peace. Now, Palestinians have avoided direct negotiations with Israel since 2014, which was midway through Obama's second term. And since that time, they have been purposely pursuing this internationalist approach and what is frequently dubbed lawfare, which of course NGO Monitor is very familiar with. Now, the problem is, I think most pragmatic, sensible people, including the Australian government, realise that that a Palestinian state will only, or a viable Palestinian state will only be established through negotiations, and therefore so they don't want to reward Palestinians for avoiding negotiations. And unfortunately, this ICC decision does reward that Palestinian decision not to go to negotiations. So in a way, it's not going to pressure Palestinians to return to the negotiations table. In fact, it's going to do the opposite. And really, if we do want peace, we need both sides actually at the negotiating table, and we need to pressure any side that refuses to join that table. Now, beyond that, Australia has always spoken out about the need of international actors to abide by international law. We are a middle power and we are completely dependent on maritime trade. Now, maritime trade requires global adherence to international law. And now, so this idea has really, over time, manifested itself into all aspects of Australian foreign policy. And it's boiled down, if you like, to the idea that, frankly, if everyone abides by international law, there will be less conflict. So with that in mind, the ICC decision, as Anne was pointing out, required clear legal gymnastics. And these legal gymnastics are really at odds with the way that Australia views the world. I mean, for instance, the ICC stated that Palestine is a state, but it also stated, and I quote, "The ICC is not constitutionally competent to determine matters of statehood." The ICC also, as Anne suggested, determined the borders of the state of Palestine before stating that in doing so, it was not seeking to determine the extent of the state's borders because, well, the state has actually yet to be established and its future borders will be the outcome of Israeli-Palestinian peace talks. So these sorts of legal dynamics, to find a way for the law to fit a predetermined conclusion, I don't think is appreciated by a government like the Australian government that has a principled approach to international law. Now, the ICC decision disregarded binding agreements between Israel and the PLO in favor of the non-binding UN General Assembly resolutions. And here, I think, is where the Australian government and other pragmatic states see a danger beyond the Israeli-Palestinian dispute. Because if binding peace agreements can be overridden, what value do they have? Why would two parties at conflict sign a peace agreement that the ICC might later find holds no water? It has the potential to undermine peace efforts in lots of different conflicts, especially since parties might mirror the Palestinian attempt to go down the internationalist route instead of trying to resolve the conflict through negotiations. So this unprincipled approach to international law, in my opinion, rankled the Australian government. And further, it goes to the heart of the court itself by allowing itself to become politicized. And that is by allowing the member states to allow Palestine to join as a state and to allow this whole process to go ahead. The court has weakened itself because a court that can be swayed by anything other than the absolute truth loses its legitimacy. And Australia and other pragmatic countries don't want the ICC to lose its legitimacy. If you like, Australia is trying to save the ICC from itself. The other problem is that the ICC intervention in the dispute has dramatically lowered the threshold of the most serious crimes that the ICC is supposed to be concerned about. Andrew, you touched on this. Consider that in the period of time of the Israeli-Palestinian dispute that the ICC wants to investigate, about 4,000 Israelis and Palestinians, that's combatants and civilians, have been killed. Now compare that to the 100,000 who have been killed in Yemen during the same period, or the 400,000 that have been killed in Syria during the same period. But the ICC is investigating those situations. It's supposed to be a court of last resort, but Palestinians have access to the Israeli legal system. So here the ICC is allowing actors to bypass this last resort criteria. So in all these ways, the ICC is undermining its own legitimacy, which is of concern to pragmatic states. So, and finally, one other thing is that Australia involves itself in international conflict. We have had troops in Afghanistan for 20 years. Our Navy is involved in anti-pirate activities in the Indian Ocean and so on and so forth. So in theory, a politicized ICC, which is held in thrall by a majority of non-democratic states, risks endangering Australia legally. If the ICC can become politicized over Israel, what's to stop it becoming politicized over, say, Australia? Now, to be honest, this is a small risk, but I think Australia has determined that it's better to take a principled stand against this sort of politicization of the ICC now to prevent further problems down the line. So to summarize, the Australian government is definitely friendly to Israel, but I think because of Australia's pragmatic and principled approach to international law, the ICC decision concerns Australia, both because the court has allowed itself to become politicized, but also because of the real, even if still remote, chance that the court's decision could have negative ramifications that might manifest themselves in other areas.
Thank you, Bren. Extremely clear. And no doubt we'll get into that a little bit more as we get into the Q&A. Just one final question before we go to the Q&A, really to both of you. And that is, where does this leave the Palestinians? You know, I know in this country here in the Netherlands, the newspapers are full of the scenes of Palestinians who are being killed by Israeli bombs, the disproportionate use of force, it looks like. And what we're talking about seems to be, you know, it's very much at the level of international law and politics and agreements. How is peace to be achieved for the ordinary Palestinians? And, you know, the ICC thinks it is advancing justice and peace for the Palestinians. But I think what you're saying, Bren, is the long-term solution to peace for all people, the Palestinians and the Jews, is through negotiations, not through international criminal tribunals or such kind of things. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. Look, international criminal tribunals have proven themselves in the past. I mean, we can talk about the situation in Yugoslavia and Rwanda and so forth, but ultimately, the Israeli-Palestinian dispute can only be resolved by Israelis and Palestinians sitting down at the negotiating table and agreeing how they're going to share the land that they both live on in a way that is viable for both sides. If you look, unfortunately, if you look at Palestinian opinion polls over the years, and you know, that's a substantial part of my PhD was to look at Palestinian and Israeli opinion polling. You can see that about 50% of Palestinians don't see the creation of a Palestinian state with all of the demands with all the conditions that they demand fulfilled, including a right of return. They don't see that as an end to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And unfortunately, that 50% has increased in the last couple of years. So now it's actually a clear majority. What this means is that a majority of Palestinians have yet to reconcile themselves to Israel's existence, or ongoing existence, and still support, if not actively fight, to end that existence. And so, yes, peace will only come when Israelis and Palestinians negotiate together, but those negotiations will only be successful if a majority, and I would say an overwhelming majority, of Palestinians want those negotiations to be successful.
Thank you very much. Yeah. So a couple of questions. One of the questions that's being asked is, who does the ICC answer to? And what can Australia or other countries do if they see this as a problem and the ICC is going down the wrong path? What can you do about it?
Well, So I'll answer the part about the ICC and who they're accountable to. There's the Assembly of State Parties, which is the governing body, if you will, of the ICC. It is comprised of all the member states of the ICC, and they set the rules and procedures of the court. They recently actually had a very big review, an independent expert review back in that the report came out in September. The review had been going on for over a year. And actually many of the questions that in that review that relate to our situation about taking on cases that are overly politicized or taking on, you know, cases that are going to be stretching their mandate beyond, you know, the confines of the Rome Statute. You know, they suggest that the court should not be doing those things. You know, so I think one thing that can be done is impressing upon, you know, members in the audience, you know, with their home governments, impressing upon them to uphold the principles of the Rome Statute, as well as these recommendations in the independent expert report. Another thing to hold the court accountable is funding, actually, because the court cannot exist without money. And particularly European countries, it's interesting, the court is not particularly transparent with its financing. Germany and Japan are huge funders of the court. Germany is probably the top donor. I'm not sure Australia, maybe Bren knows how much money Australia gives. But you know, that's another thing that's, you know, money talks, and that's the way member states can hold the court accountable. Really, and then also exposing these issues with the procedure. I think those are the primary ways that, you know, of what can be done to hold the court accountable.
Right. What about you, Bren? Anything to add on that?
Not as to who the ICC ends to. I think Anne's done that and caught accountable. Look, it's true that pressure on home governments to pressure the ICC through their membership of the Assembly of States Parties. It's an interesting dilemma, though, because if you are a member of the ICC, you have signed and ratified the Rome Statute, and you are obligated to fulfill things that the ICC wants you to fulfill, obviously within the realms of the treaty. So, for instance, if the ICC issues an arrest warrant for an Israeli, you as an ICC member are required to fulfill it. And so, were an Israeli to be in Australia, and arrest warrants can be issued secretly. And so, an Israeli might travel to Australia, and an arrest warrant be issued. So, the Australian government would therefore have a real ethical and legal dilemma as to what it should do. So, I mean, I think because the Australian government has rejected the ICC decision, it would probably be, I believe, in the government's interest to flag now that it won't fulfill an arrest warrant should one, you know, of an Israeli on its territory, should one be requested, rather than panic if and when the time comes and not know what to do. But look, but you know, that's obviously a decision for the Australian government. But it has dilemmas, and in fact, this threat of arrest for and particularly secret warrants really is a key problem once the investigation, or if the investigation into Israel really cranks up, because it could decimate Israeli diplomatic and business ventures. So it's quite worrying.
Mm.
Yeah.
A couple of people are asking about settlements, and you mentioned that the word settlement does not appear in any of the treaties, not in the Fourth Geneva Convention, nor in the Rome Statute. I think there are really two questions. One is, and the key one is, well, what are we talking about when we talk about settlements? And specifically East Jerusalem. Has Israel moved people into East Jerusalem? How did they get there? And is there any real potential that could be considered a war crime?
Right. So I mean, it's quite offensive. I actually live in Jerusalem. So to me, it's quite offensive that, you know, my kids went to school in the old city of Jerusalem, you know, so it's quite offensive to me that the International Criminal Court is saying that my kid's elementary school is a war crime. I mean, it's really shocking and outrageous, frankly. Prior to the war in 1948, I had cousins that lived in the old city, and they were ethnically cleansed from the Jordanians. And to say that if they had gone back to the old city after the war after 1967, when it was liberated, that they would be war criminals for moving there, or people in the Israeli government are war criminals for allowing them to go back and live there. It's really, you know, that's really the only way I can describe it as offensive. Just another point, my father-in-law survived the Holocaust in a Siberian labor camp. He was deported by the he was in Poland, deported by the Soviets before the Nazis got to his village, and went to Israel in 1950 and was living in the last house on the Green Line with Jordanian forces on the other side, and they were shot at every single day. And so, you know, imagine, you know, most of your family being murdered in the Holocaust, you surviving in a slave labor camp for 4 years, essentially, and then coming to Israel and being shot at by the Jordanians, and then to say now that, you know, they want to restore a situation where that is a possibility is really, I don't know how that's in keeping with criminal justice or human rights or humanitarian law. I don't see how that's, you know, how that's even keeping with it. And really, I mean, when you look at the decision of the court, of the prosecutor, you know, right now we don't know, there's no cases yet before the court, but we have an inkling of what the prosecutor was thinking, because every year she submits these preliminary examination reports and then in her brief to the pretrial chamber. And she specifically mentions not only, you know, the West Bank, also known as Judea and Samaria, but also in Jerusalem. You know, she mentions there are, I think she claims to identify 12 settlements in Jerusalem. You know, so to me, it sounds like she is looking to do that. And just in terms of defining a settlement, I mean, that's really the thing, because when you know, you look at these UN resolutions or reports or things the prosecutor has said, they essentially are defining a settlement as anything over the Green Line, which was the armistice lines from the war in 49, 48. And, you know, that, so it's just an incoherent, it's incoherent, you know, so, and that also conflicts with the principles of international humanitarian law, the laws of armed conflict. You know, so a road is a settlement. You know, no one has really defined this term. And that's, I think, something also highly troubling. And just the last point I'll say is, there are other places in the world that you've mentioned where there is settlement activity. We have Northern Cyprus, Georgia, you know, South Ossetia and Georgia, where the Russians have done settlements, much greater demographic scale and scope than what we have here. And the prosecutor does have jurisdiction in those areas, and yet she has done nothing on settlements. She's had jurisdiction in Northern Cyprus since the very beginning of the court's functioning and has not done anything. In February, she gave a talk where she said her decision on the Cyprus case would be imminent. That was back in February. I have yet to hear anything about her decision, and she's leaving the position in a month. And so it's just quite curious that there have been opportunities to weigh in on exactly what is a settlement, how is this defined under the terms of the Rome Statute, and yet the only time it's ever coming up is in our situation. So that leads me to conclude there are other, you know, factors motivating what's going on.
Thank you. I'll come back to that with another question that's been asked. But in the meantime, Bren, a question for you. The right of return Palestinians claim the right of return. They claim that all Palestinians who were forced or for whatever reason left Palestine in the various conflicts and might be living in New York or Melbourne or any other country have a right to go back to not just to the West Bank, but to even to their old former houses in Israel. Is this a strategy of the Palestinians in some way to avoid negotiations?
I don't think it's a strategy as such. I think it's more of an own goal. If you talk to pragmatic Palestinians, including the current Palestinian leadership, or at least the Palestinian leadership in the West Bank, they know that the right of return will never be implemented. They've admitted as much, and in negotiations, they've apparently given it away that it's not going to happen. But the problem is they've been selling the message to their people since the 1950s that there will be a right of return, and they've been selling this message for more than half a century. And so at some stage, they have to compromise. They have to basically say, "Oh, sorry, you know, that promise that we've made 70 odd years, it's not going to happen." But in order to do that, it's obviously they're going to need a lot of political capital. Okay. The problem is the Palestinian leadership is completely and utterly despised by the Palestinian people because they're corrupt and they are autocratic and they are kleptocratic, and the people can't stand them, and so they have no political capital. So they can't afford to make a whopping big compromise like that, because it'll be the last straw. So they've got to keep on this constant assertion of the right of return, and sort of everyone knows that it's just a negotiating tactic, that they'll get a big enough concession out of Israel, then they'll say, "All right, right of return's out of the way," but they can't do it for this reasons of concession. Now, of course, there are many Palestinians who fundamentally believe that the right of return must happen. There's no way they'd ever compromise, and the majority of the Palestinian people believe that because they've been sold this message forever. But among the pragmatic Palestinian leadership, yeah, there are some that still want it to happen and won't ever compromise, but there's plenty who know it won't happen, but just keep on pushing the line because they don't really have a choice.
Right. But obviously, if pardon me, if the Palestinians return, then their numbers.
Oh, absolutely.
Well,
it's a non-starter. The right of return would completely overwhelm Israel's demographics. There would be one Arab state and one majority Arab state with a handful of Jews. And the reality is most Jews who could afford to leave, or many Jews who could afford to leave, would in a situation like that. Civil war wouldn't be far away. The only time where the Arab, where Jews lived in Palestine, the only time where Jews lived as a minority was during the British Mandate, obviously not the Ottoman Empire. Anyway, the point is where there was two significant populations, a Jewish population and an Arab population. There was violence. There was a lot of violence that ultimately descended into Israel's War of Independence. It's a non-starter. Israel will never allow it to happen in negotiations, in my opinion. I think the overwhelming majority of Israelis would be fundamentally against it. There's obviously a handful of Israelis that think it's a good idea, but it's a non-starter.
So final question, guys. There's a few questions, by the way. I'm sorry, we don't have time to deal with all the questions that have been put, but a number of people are also asking, and I think it's a good question for both of you to finish with. What's really behind this? Can you say, is this really a legal conflict? Is it a political conflict? Is it a conflict about land, or is there a deeper perspective? Is it a spiritual conflict even?
Yeah, I think it's all of the above. It's all of those factors. I mean, you have two peoples, that have competing claims, and on all of those factors, legally, politically, spiritually, the way forward, I think, is via negotiations between the two sides. Unfortunately, I don't think they will be successful until there is an acceptance of Jewish presence and rights to living in this land, in this region. It's just not going to be possible until there is a recognition of that. But the way forward is to have that recognition and then to negotiate an arrangement, that allows both peoples, as Brent said earlier, to live in peace and share the territory. So I'm not optimistic, but because of all of those factors, I think that's why it is the most, probably intractable conflict, in probably human history. So, or at least modern history. Yeah.
Bren, you wrote a book.
Yeah, well, I agree with that. And it is all of the above. But there are people on each side that are willing, that might not particularly like the other, but are willing to share or divide the territory between them. And their end result would be a two-state outcome and the peace process that we all talk about. But there are people on each side that for, whether it's for ideological or for religious reasons, do not want to share the land, or at least do not want a Palestinian state, or on the Palestinian side do not want an Israeli state in the land that they say God granted them. And for Israelis, the majority are willing to divide the land, assuming that Israel's safety won't be completely undermined. For the Palestinians, unfortunately, opinion polls suggest that the majority don't want to divide the land. But until those people that want to end the existence of the other side politically, until they are a significant minority, there's no chance of peace. I often use an anecdote of Northern Ireland, in that after I think in the possibly 1972, but in the early days of the Troubles, there was something called the Sunningdale Agreement, and it involved a bit of power sharing, a bit of this, bit of that, and it collapsed very, very quickly. And then the 1998 Good Friday Agreement basically looked a lot like the Sunningdale Agreement. There wasn't much difference there, but it was accepted, because during that period of time, the overwhelming majority of people in Northern Ireland on both sides got sick of killing the other side and got sick of dying, and peace was possible. And about 3 or 4 months after the Good Friday Agreement, there was a big bomb in Ulmer. 29 people died, and the so-called real IRA, which was an IRA splinter group, set off the bomb. And there was wall-to-wall condemnation of that bomb from both communities. And that was an indication, it was at that moment that the peace process succeeded, because that was an indication that both sides wanted the peace to succeed. And unfortunately, during the Israeli-Palestinian peace process, when there is terrorism, it's usually Palestinian terrorism, there isn't wall-to-wall condemnation of that terrorist violence that undermines the peace process. There's usually no condemnation of that terrorist violence that undermines the peace process. So as Anne said, until both sides are willing to sit down, and both sides are willing to share or divide the land on an ongoing basis, then there's unfortunately no chance of peace. So no, I'm not optimistic here.
Thank you both so much for your time, your expertise that you've shared with us. I'm going to hand the floor back to you, Cornelis.
Well, dear participants of this webinar, thank you for joining this webinar, the wonderful words spoken in this webinar. As a rational thinking human being, then considering the politicizing of the ICC, what's happening towards Israel, it's, for me as a rational human being, it's insane what's happening in the world. And we spoke about international law and about the Rome Statute, but what does the Bible say? The Word of God. We are now nearby finishing this webinar, but allow me to share in just a few minutes what the Bible says. For the Jews, the Tanakh, the Old Testament, is the Holy Word of God. For us as Christians, that same Tanakh and the New Testament is the Holy Word of God. We read in the Bible that the Lord, the God of Israel, gave the land of Israel to the Jewish people as an everlasting possession. And he also told that the land may not be sold or given away because it's the land of the Lord himself. And he gave it to the Jewish people as an everlasting possession, and everlasting means everlasting, not ending. And when you read the New Testament, the Christian Bible, there is no passage in the New Testament, not a single text, that might give the impression that God's covenants and promises for Israel are finished. Nowhere. They're only confirmed. There is no man in the New Testament than Jesus Christ himself who quoted more from the Tanakh than whoever. But allow me to read a wonderful, for me, a very impressive passage in the Tanakh, the Old Testament, Zechariah 2. And Zechariah 2 speaks about the future for the Jewish people and the city of Jerusalem. And then the prophet says, "Sing for joy and be glad, O daughter of Zion. For behold, I'm coming, and I will dwell in your midst, declares the Lord. Many nations will join themselves to the Lord in that day and will become my people. Then I will dwell in your midst, and you will know that the Lord of hosts has sent me to you. The Lord will possess Judah as his portion in the Holy Land, and will again choose Jerusalem." So what's happening? 2,600 years ago, the daughter of Jerusalem, that are the inhabitants of the city of Jerusalem, the Jewish inhabitants. And the Lord says, "Rejoice, because I will come in your midst." And then the Lord speaks about many nations will join the Lord. We as Christians, we believe that it refers to us, that we are those many nations, those many churches that will join the Lord as well as the Jewish people. So this means that the promises and covenants with Israel do not finish when the Christian church came in. Because in the end, the Lord says, he will possess Judah and he will again choose Jerusalem. And that's why the Jewish inhabitants of Jerusalem may rejoice, because the Lord will live in the city of Jerusalem. He did in the past, he will do it in the future, and his election of Israel and the city of Jerusalem for the Jewish people is still valid and will be valid in the future. And in the New Testament, the Christian Bible, all these promises are confirmed in the Gospels and also in the letter of Paul, who writes a letter to the church in Rome, and he explained about the everlasting position of the Jewish people and Israel in God's plan. And then in the end of each chapter, he says the next thing. Then Paul says, "For I say that Christ has become a servant to the circumcision on behalf of the truth of God to confirm the promises given to the fathers." So what is Paul saying? God gave promises and covenants to the Jewish people from the beginning to Abraham and all the other fathers. And then nearing the end of the New Testament, Paul says that even Jesus Christ came to confirm these promises. So for me as a rational human being, for me as a Bible-believing Christians, Jerusalem and the whole land of Israel is God's promised land to the Jewish people. It was, and it is, and it will always be in the future. And that's the Holy Word, and that means more for me than whatever statute or legislation. I want to thank you all for attending and participating in this webinar. I want to thank our guest speakers, Anne Hetzberg and Brent Carler from Australia. I would like to say to you in Australia, sleep well. And for all the others, have a good day. Thank you again. And on behalf of Andrew Tucker, I think we enjoyed having this webinar with you together in a joint cooperation, and hope to organize more webinars for you in the future. Thanks again, have a good day, and may the God of Israel bring the real peace of Jerusalem. Thank you.